Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think that is the beauty of having such forums as this on a digital platform, is that wherever you are in the world, you can tune in and you're very welcomed. My name is Adelle Onyango. I'm a media personality from right here in Nairobi, Kenya. And what we're about to do, all right, because we're leading up to the new Africa France Summit, we are going to spotlight Kenyan voices for gender equality and have a very necessary conversation, unpacking some of the things that we need to do going forward as a country, as a continent, honestly, as the global community to actualize gender equality. And the reason that we're doing this is because later this year in October, if the pandemic allows us, we will be having the new Africa France Summit. And this is going to be happening in France just to really check and revisit the bases and orientations in terms of the relationship between France and Africa. And one of the core issues that's going to be brought up is gender equality, understandably. And because of this, the French embassy in Nairobi, alongside 9 other French embassies across Africa, have been having a series of dialogues, such as the one that we're going to have this morning. And in these dialogues, what's been happening is we turn on the mic in front of very young Africans who are in their own right gender equality champions. And they're doing things that are helping us advance towards gender equality and hear their thoughts on various issues. And we also share the views of how we can see collaborations between France and Kenya when it comes to the actualization of gender equality. And so this is going to be the third stop of such series of dialogues. And I'm really excited because the third stop is on gender equality. And what we're going to be unpacking is where Kenya is at, what needs to change in terms of education, in terms of the industries and economy, centering women around that, in terms of the media, what is the media's role, in terms of our culture as a people. Are there things that are hindering or even helping us progress further towards that? And this is also going to be quite an interesting conversation, not only because of the Africa France Summit that's coming up in October, but also because of the Gender Equality Forum, which, as you know, has been co-organized by France, Mexico, and the UN Women. Kenya has also been very vocal, saying that it is committed towards ending gender-based violence. And so I think it's very important for us to have that conversation and really unpack the commitment we're making as Kenya and see whether is that really translating on ground. So there's a lot of issues we're going to be tackling and unpacking this morning in the conversation, and I'm very excited to do it on Africa Day. Yeah, so first and foremost, happy Africa Day to you. 25th of May is the day that we celebrate the creation of the Africa Union, and it is the International Africa Day, so it's quite beautiful that we're having this conversation today. So to help me unpack this conversation, we have fantastic Africans who are joining me today. I'm going to start with Naomi Mwaura, who is doing such amazing work. She is the director at the Flown Initiative that is really centering women in terms of a very important industry that is transport. And she's going to be helping us see what are the economic benefits of putting power in terms of business and economy in the hands of women and the work that they've been able to do as Flown Initiative. So very happy to have you.
Thank you.
And happy Africa Day. We also have Mariga Thoithi. Good morning, and thank you for coming, who is a columnist, a writer, and a researcher, and I have to say is also a champion for gender equality. And it's really important to have you here because you break down the role of media so beautifully. You also break down the role of men when we're having the gender equality conversation. So I'm very glad to have you here, and happy Africa Day to you as well.
Happy Africa Day to you, Adele. Thank you.
And last but not least, she came all the way from Eldoret this morning. I'm so excited to have you, and just so touched that you came all this way to have this conversation. We have Sarah Cherono, who is a female doctor in organic chemistry and a lecturer at the Moi University in Eldoret, flew into Nairobi this morning to have this conversation. Good morning.
Morning to you.
And happy Africa Day.
You too.
And we're going to slide more coffee your way because we know you come the furthest from all of us. I think I just want to jump right in. Because I think one thing that lacks for me whenever we have the conversation on gender equality is people don't really talk about the economic benefits. It's almost presented as something that only puts power in women's hands, but there's no wholesome view and breakdown of it into, okay, fine. What does this mean for the economy? What does this mean for households? What does this mean for the entire ecosystem? And if you really unpack that, then you see that there are actual positive, positive influences or things that stream from gender equality that affect everybody. And I'd love you, Naomi, to come in here because of Flown Initiative, which is a women-led organization working towards the creation of safe, sustainable, and accessible public transportation spaces for women and vulnerable groups in Africa. And transportation is a key industry, and we could learn so much from the work that you're doing. And women still do keep off from getting into that industry for very important reasons. And maybe through your work, can you tell us some of the things that have led women to keep out from an industry that could ultimately benefit them economically?
Thank you, Adele. So first of all, let me start with definition of public transport, because as you're aware that the Kenyan public transport is not really public because it's privately owned and run.
Yeah.
And our definition is matatus, definitely tuk-tuk, and boda-bodas. And it's been very male-dominated for quite some time. And when we look at women professionals in the industry, we see that there are three areas we look at, and that's attracting them into the industry, retaining them in the industry, and also advancing them within the industry. And so when you look at the issues in those three areas, when you look at attracting, how do you, as a woman and even as a man, get into the industry? There is no, there's no HR firm that recruits matatu operators. I don't know if you've ever seen a CV of somebody who has been a conductor. There's no such thing. And so that has really been one of the biggest barriers to getting women into the industry. When we conducted research, we found out that most of the women had either worked in restaurants where matatu operators were going to eat, and that way they got to talk to the drivers, and before long they're like, hey, I need a conductor. And then they realize they can actually get more as conductors than being waiters. We've had women who've worked as mama fuas, who've now moved into the industry. Some were even street preachers who moved into the industry. So it's a rewarding industry, but with very long working hours. Yeah. And now I'm getting into the retention where you have they work about 12 hours a day. Right. And most of them are single parents, right, with kids at home. And this has even gotten more complicated, especially with COVID, where kids are at home and where, for example, parents are required to help out with homework much more. And so the turnover is really high. So on average, we can say that most of our women who've stayed in the industry have stayed for about minimum of 3 years, right? But that's like a very few bit of it. And so we found with our women in transport program is that we were really putting a lot of work in retaining the women who are already there. When you talk about advancement, again, there is no professional school where you can go to learn how to be a stage manager or how to be,
a conductor.
Or a SACCO, part of SACCO management team or part of a SACCO board chairperson. Right, and so we've been doing a lot of professional development courses to our women to try and just move them up. So, for example, we've just wrapped up a project with the French Embassy, where we took about 33 women who are conductors in the Nairobi metropolitan area and took them through a 6-month course to help them become female matatu drivers. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So you kind of had to start from zero in developing, because there is no course, there is no HR, as you're saying. So you kind of like are starting from the ground up.
Yes.
Are there issues of women's safety as well that keep women out of that public transport industry?
A lot. I think that has been one of the biggest issues that push out women as commuters and also as professionals. We are working with a public transport industry that has not looked into how different genders travel, right? So, for example, we found out that women have different travel needs. So you find that, for example, a woman will maybe in the morning go to work, and then in the evening she has to do a couple of errands. And so you find that you say, okay, so this butchery that has the meat I like is in this place. The mama mboga who has good mama mboga is in this place.
Yeah.
And so there are shorter trips done as opposed to men where it's, for example, they leave work and then they go straight home. So with women, you find there's a lot more shorter trips that are not in the same place. So you find that she'll go to this butchery here, and then she'll go to Mama Mboga over there, and then, she'll go somewhere else to buy something else. And then in addition of what are the women concerns as commuters, for example, we found out that safety was one of the highest determinant of what mode of transport they use. Men had the same issues of safety, but not safety in terms of a sexual nature.
Yeah.
Right. It's more safety in terms of karawa tanipata, right? Or will the policeman come and get me?
Yeah.
But women, their concerns were more of as I mentioned, sexual nature.
Sexual safety.
When we come to women professionals, we found that their safety concerns involved safety in the workplace in terms of harassment coming from their colleagues. This was further amplified by COVID, where, for example, as I mentioned, there is no formal recruitment process. And so the matatu drivers, for example, determine who their conductors are. That's a lot of power, right? And so with the government directives, for example, of having 60% capacity, you find that some people were saying, okay, the cost of running a matatu is too much because you still have to pay the county fees and all that. And so you find that most of our women ended up being unemployed, right? And so that means you have to talk to other drivers to see who can give you a job. And what's happened is that there were said, okay, you want a job? Then
Sexual
favors came up. The issue of harassment from commuters was reported like a major concern. We've had most of our women beaten with more handbags than we could ever count. Yes, that's a really big issue. Verbal insults, physical, both coming from the commuters, their fellow colleagues, and also the police and the city council.
Oh my goodness. This is just, it's so much to unpack because those are real fears that will actually keep you from getting into an industry that could help you fend for your household and your family. And it's funny you bring up the pandemic as well, because I was reading how some of the issues that we're going to face when we look at burnout, that women and black African women are going to be the highest in that percentage because the pandemic now added 2 or 3 more roles. So you're teaching, you're a caregiver for those who are sick, and you're going to work as well. Yet we're talking about advancing towards gender equality. How do we do that when these are still really real issues, And Sarah, I would like to bring you in here at this point, because when we talk about the economy and kind of like the job industry and how we get more women in there, if we unpack and we go back, we stop at education, right? And what do you think, in your opinion, is education's role in the advancement and the actualization of gender equality? Because I think it plays a very critical role.
Thank you, Adele. I must start by just saying I'm just happy to be here. It's a pleasure. And just as you have said, there's no way we can have gender equality without education.
True.
In other words, it is actually the lack of education that is causing these deep-rooted disparities and differences between in the society between men and women. Women can do this, women can go into a matatu business. It is because of a lack of education. That is why we have all these differences. And when education actually is something that brings people into a platform that helps them to understand what they actually need to know. Is it like they are able to question themselves? Is what we are doing wrong or right? You know, it's a platform where people can be able to learn exactly what went wrong. You know what I'm saying actually. Just following up from Naomi. Naomi has told us about the problems that women face, and sometimes they are harassed by fellow colleagues, they are harassed by several guys, and I'm asking myself, what can be the issue? Why is it that this is the way it is? And simply, it is all because we are lacking somewhere. The women are lacking in our society to know their privileges, to know their rights in the society. How can I go and get my grievances, or how can I get justice in whatever that is going on? It's because they were never brought into a platform. And when you look at the Kenyan, not only the Kenyan, the African context, we usually take, like, we have some gender discrimination. We usually prefer taking men to school compared to boys. When you discuss, you're like, it's better for a man to learn. And we have this notion that if men learn, they are going to benefit the family. But if you teach a lady, they are going to get married and they are going to benefit another family. You know, such scenarios will actually make most of the African parents actually choose or prefer to educate men compared to ladies. And you know, it's like normal in the society. Like, it has been engraved in us that even when we go to our villages, especially in a rural setting, when the ladies actually drop out of school, no one will ask, why is it that the lady has dropped out? It's like the norm. It's like there's no big deal. This is a lady, she knows what she wants, she's going to get married, she's going to get well. But what happens is that the society never questions. We never question, we never look at the consequence of what has happened in these women. Why is it that is there anything that comes out if our girls drop out of school? What exactly comes out after everything is said and done? And you know, this actually comes out after a period of time when you realize we have women in the society who let me call them underprivileged. They never got the education that they needed, so they cannot even be able to know how to read or how to know the rights according to the law, where exactly which places to go, so that they can know where to get justice. They don't even know that they have the right even to own property because of the society that you have been brought up with. So the consequence to that is really, really too much, that we really need to sit down and look at the context of education, what education really helps us in. Because when you look at these women that you are bringing out into the society, these will be women that cannot even go out and look for income generating activities. Why? They were never taught. They never know that I can do ABCD. Let's say I can farm in this way and get this amount of produce so that we can help in the economy. And we end up generally as an African continent losing a lot in when it comes to economy, because we have such a look at the education of the culture. We don't really value it, and we place it in such a place that it's not a big deal. It's like it's not really important. If a girl reads a lot, maybe they get a PhD, or they are good at something. You know, the society will always come there and try to bring them down, tell them you are not going to produce, you're not going to be able to balance your life, I don't know, social life and career life. You know, it's a lot of things that the society brings up in a woman. And actually that is because we are lacking somewhere. We never went through some education so that we can know this is exactly what we should do.
What I love about what you brought up is not only education in terms of the subjects or courses that we socially stereotype as, okay, this is space for men only, this is space for women, but also the education when it comes to our rights and where do we go for certain things, who do we talk to for certain things. I think that information not only for women, but how do we work that into our education system so that we don't have gender equality conversations when people are over 30. It's something that even in primary school, you could be doing projects around it to really understand what is this issue and why is it important. I think still under education, and I'd love you to chime in, Mariga, is talking about, because we're not living in a vacuum as women, right?
Yeah.
So what is education's role when you look at the journey of a young boy to a man, and then now where we are right now, where we're talking about gender equality, when we're talking about the gender gap? I think I as of last year, they say we'll only actualize that in 100, reduce the gap in 136 years.
Yeah.
So we won't see it, and I was like, what? And we're fighting so hard, we won't see it. So we're really doing this for the generations to come.
Yeah.
What do you think is education's role in that journey for young boys and men?
So let me start by one of the saddest things I realized was I think I started being actively aware about gender and gender inequality perhaps actively in my late 20s. It's not a very good thing to say, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Right? It's you live your whole life unaware of many things. And what drove me to gender equality was my push towards, I have a lot of leanings towards governance and politics, and eventually realizing that it was connected, right? But most people won't, because most people aren't in that space and aren't privileged enough to sit in certain circles and certain spaces which have moved in that sense, right? That's a big problem, because most people's awareness, even the men who we feel are aware about gender issues, it tends to happen later on in life, their late 20s to their 30s, right? It first usually starts with a relative situation where it's somebody and then if you're willing to do the work, then you start expanding your work around theory and work around your own life, right? It's usually a very hard thing, because one of the hardest things to think through is that your complicity in all of it. That's what stops you, because in many senses, many of the discussions which are stopped by men, you talk about men do ABC, is that I do it, right? And many, it's usually an extreme thing, right? Men are sexual assaulters. I have not sexually assaulted any woman, and thus I am an exception to this rule. But if you to really think through it, and I say this literally without doubt, every single man has violated consent in some sense, even at a basic level against women, right? And that's why even lessons like conversations on consent are difficult, because many of these conversations tend to hit personally, even to people who feel are exceptional. And so now back to like the build up of the question, right? The role of education and undoing all this, it literally starts from home, right? So it's again, the personal is political. There's people sensibility, it's so different.
Yeah.
How you are raised will literally affect how your country is governed and how you view your female chief justice. There's no vast separation of it, right? As a personal experience, I was raised by mom and I had we were two boys. And so I recent discussions around gender roles and I laugh. Because now no gender roles in the house, we're three boys.
Yeah. You did it.
We washed the house and did every single thing possible. And so it was really interesting. Like for a personal perspective, to go to school and then hear about gender roles, because it didn't actually exist in the house, right?
Yeah.
There was no space. So I actually got introduced to gender roles in school, as opposed to seeing them at home, because it didn't exist. And then in school, a lot of it is really unconscious, and a lot of it, people say these are really small and tiny things. It's everything from who's asked to take the glasses from the table, right? Who's asked to serve the tea, who's asked to serve the rest, who's asked to sit up and stand. Like they're very small and tiny things that need to be addressed. And you are right, like in many senses, right? You talk about 130 years before we perhaps gain gender equality. I mean, it's not even for our children.
Yeah.
It's literally
it's
not.
past,
It's not for.
Yeah.
Yes. At best, we achieve it in our great grandkids, right? And a lot of it requires, especially for men, requires bravery and standing out, and it comes at a cost. Right, one of my good friends called Rick's poet, and we have conversations with him sometimes because I've done work on masculinity and I have a full-time column, and so does he, right? And wants to do a podcast on it. But there is a cost to some of these things which you have to be ready to pay, right? There's a cost to having basic conversations I'm talking to men about health is you are going to be fought about it for the next couple of years and probably forever. Doesn't mean don't do it, it just means you need more men willing to pay the cost. So let me give you an interesting story. So over the weekend I was at a party and it was my nephew's party and I sat with my younger cousins who were like 15 or 16, right? So 2 boys, 2 girls. And it's so vastly different talking to these children. My goodness. Because the 2 girls are in the British system school. And for example, their knowledge around gender and gender equality and oppression and the math was astounding. I didn't have any of this knowledge until at best 10 years later, right? And then I talk to younger cousins who are the boys and it's very different. It's extremely different. One, because they're not actively aware of it. And again, these are things that you don't think through, right? When you're 15, again, there's no biases. You're just a kid, right? The only thing they would actually know would be things that they have been taught. But listen, it's a very massive level of this difference in understanding between boys at that age and girls at that age. And there is a need, because at some point I was doing a mentorship program and I feel like I need to bring it back because I realize how differently these kids are raised. It won't change.
Yeah.
Unless you actively change it, because schools in many situations are very rigid. Schools work based off systems. They don't change. So there need to be a lot of one. I feel like in many senses it's not visible and it's not like apparent, but there has been like movements forward, right? In terms of like gender equality in many senses, how many men think it's not big enough and shouldn't be lauded, Again,
it's just saying it's there.
Someone's boot is on your neck. If they take it off just a little bit, your job isn't to congratulate them that they took their boot off just a little bit more. However, there has been movement, but one of the things now we need to move people from is this movement from, in many senses, there's awareness, right? In many senses, and there's awareness
in many people, it's just, in many senses, patriarchy is very contradictory, right? You have men, for example, the reason they take their girls to school is because they don't want their girls dependent on men. However, the same men do not want to acknowledge that there's a gender disparity or that sexism exists.
Yeah.
The same men who will warn other men against playing around with their sisters will also say there's nothing like sexism or inequality that exists. They see it. It's just a very, again, patriarchy is very contradictory.
Right?
It is. Now, it moves from, there needs to be a movement from awareness to a movement from awareness to connection with first, I usually propose a connection to the personal and to your own life, because that's the only way through which you can now start analyzing the systemic issues. Because if you're not able to analyze your own life and your role in it, it becomes very difficult for you to critique anything else outside of that. And then now beyond that, it's men, and in many senses, raising their boys differently from the household. It's really useless for me to be aware of a lot of these issues around gender and around the way power is exerted if I don't do something and I don't help and I don't raise my younger siblings better, I don't raise my children better. And there's a very big gap. And it will take a while, but it needs a few brave men to just push through it, to acknowledge their role in it. But more than that, to be willing to push through it in spite of all the pushback they will get.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think you've touched on quite important points. There's a lot of introspection that needs to be done. And you introspect, what is your role? What do I need to change as myself and my spaces of influence? And then now look at the systemic changes that need to happen once you've done that very hard work. I think the harder work is like looking at yourself and thinking, what have I contributed? And what behavior changes need to happen with me, So I absolutely agree with you on that. And I think you've all touched on such important points, with Naomi bringing up about when you look at the industry and look at what women could gain by joining an industry that is as big as and important as transport, and what's keeping them out, and those who are in, what are they facing on a day-to-day, even before the pandemic, and education. What does that look like, and what do we need to change, both education in the home and education in schools. I just want to pause here and say, as you're watching this, feel free to drop a comment in the chat section. I do know that our poster said we were going to be joined by Chef Okori. Unfortunately, she had another engagement that came up and she couldn't be with us, but we do still laud her for being such a gender champion in leading these conversations. But that's why she's not with us today. Before we move on to, because you said columnist, now we need to spotlight media and be like, what is not happening? Media always seems to be catching a lot of heat, but hey, understandably. I just want to come back to you, Naomi, because I think one thing that when we talk about the disconnect, and when it comes to the economic benefit of gender equality and making sure that women are earning, is how it trickles down to households. It trickles down to the economy, and you can literally, like, research has shown, you put money in a woman's hand, there's positive impact on the household, positive impact on the economy. But sometimes when we have that conversation, we don't go there, and there's some people who understand it better when you unpack it from that area. And I just want you to speak to that from the women who you've been able, through Flown Initiative, to put money in their hands and put them into this industry. What are some of those trickle-down effects that you see in their lives?
Thank you for that question. I think let me start with, we were piloting something. So when COVID struck, as I mentioned, about over 50% of our women in transport members lost their jobs. And so we tried to pilot unconditional cash transfers.
Okay.
It's a very controversial topic. People say that if people are used to unconditional cash transfers, then, probably they'll not work. They'll be dependent on that. But we took a gamble. And what happened, so we were given about 2,000 shillings, that's $20 per household, that is per woman. So on average, our members have about, on average, 3 kids. And after we gave the conditional cash transfers for about 2-3 months, we did it for about 4 months. But in that period, we were also helping them get other jobs. And so when we did a study of what they had done with the money, we realized that most of them had actually sent their kids up country. Right?
Wow,
yes, because of COVID, they've lost their jobs. The kids are home, so they send them up country. And so majority of our women sent the entire amount to their relatives who are taking care of their kids. Right?
Oh, man, yeah.
And that we're like, wow, okay, if for example, our supporter had asked us, what do you think the women will use it for? We would have said maybe health insurance, because, there's a pandemic, that's something you might want to have. Maybe, I don't know, food, rent. That money didn't go there.
And so that's supporting another household.
Yes, that's supporting another entire household. That's not even in our scope of work.
Yeah.
Right. So that was pretty interesting to just see what 2,000 shillings or $20 can do. Right. So imagine what more we can do if we equip the women with the skills to actually earn the money. Right. Because this was a desperate action, right, or intervention. And you see how little it was, honestly. But at that time, that's all we could afford. And so imagine if we moved women to positions in transport where they could be, for example, more stage managers, we could move to maybe them becoming circle owners, vehicle owners, investors, startup entrepreneurs, right? So it could really change the way we look at public transport if we put more money into the hands of women, right? And put them in decision-making positions.
I think that's very important, especially whenever we have the conversations about having more access for women into industries. I'm like, yes, that's very important. But also, where are you? Because it doesn't help if you're saying you're allowed until here, which is really what the conversation becomes, right? And then the decisions are still not making the change because you've actually not changed too much. I want us to touch on media, and feel free to chime in, because there's media practitioners. I like how I've excluded myself. When media is about to get heat, I'm like, oh no, I'm not inside there. And because there's media practitioners, but then there's also us who consume media, right? And we may want to see any changes. So please feel free to just chime in at any point. But maybe, Madriga, you can touch on media shapes narratives, right? It helps us understand certain things. It's our go-to, whether you're talking about digital or traditional media platforms. It's our go-to for where we get information. And while we're getting that information, how it's presented will skew our understanding of said information, And so you can't have a conversation on any form of transformative change you're bringing in any sector without bringing in media. And I do know you maybe you can also speak to not only media's role, but your experience with your column, because there are some topics that you unpack in a way that, as you say, there's a cost to it, or in a way that people feel like it's hitting too close to home when you're talking about gender issues. But what do you think is the role of media? And in your experience, when you've been trying to use that role of media, what has the effect been? Have you seen change?
That's been a very interesting journey, right? So I started doing this column in August of 2019, but I've been doing masculinity work for 3-4 years before that. And it was really interesting, right? So you get the column, and then one of the things you have to decide, I realize as a media practitioner, is what kind of person you're going to be. You need to figure out, you fashion your own identity, right? And I took over a pretty intense column, which had pretty heavy writers before me. So I came after Oyunga Pala and after Biko Zulu, right? And so these are household names. And I got in and I had no idea what I was going to do. And I floundered somewhere in between that, but decided that I was going to shape the column into who I was. And that didn't come very easily. So I completely shifted the column, because I remember having full-on discussions for months. No one tells you things about, like, with your editors or your producers about, like, how the first few months of an actual show go.
Yes.
Right? No one has that conversation.
Education.
It's about a push and pull.
Yeah.
You have a push and pull because my leanings, for example, I'm political in many senses. I talk about justice. So I moved a lifestyle column to sometimes talking about police brutality on young men. Because someone's like, it's too heavy. I'm like, no, I'm writing about men for men. I won't be writing about relationships every day. It makes no sense. And so I completely expanded the column, but that didn't come without a cost, right? Because after this feedback around, when I wrote an article a couple of weeks back around the consent issue, around the media discussion that was had, start being asked if you're writing for women or for men. I'm like, what do you mean? And you literally get abused. The online circles of incel online circles who will literally abuse you for a very long time around it, right? But it's necessary. The truth is that in many senses, I feel that we should have better media practitioners, but even more than that, what I feel now, going back to your point, is that we need to have more people in authority who are feminist. That's the only way that it accepts it, because that's how a lot of these things get filtered through, right?
So you mean authority, like, so now decision makers within the media?
Yes. Because you have either two options. One, you have exceptions, like me, who decide I'm going to come and I'm going to write about A, B, and C. I write about contraception, why men need to take contraception. I'm recently in a discussion because I want to have a discussion around, like, men and cervical cancer and why they need to care about it, all these things. But you'd need an editor who feels that it's okay for you to expand it. Because for many columns, and I'm grateful to have the editor that I have, wouldn't be able to do it. The way my column, for example, was structured for 10 years wasn't around this completely. And so it's taken years, it's taken a while of pushing back to expand what, for example, this column called Man Talk looks like. And so now people are not surprised when I talk about contraceptives or this kind of cancer or this or that, because they've done it for a while. But for many writers that I know, right, many writers are limited by what they're not, and I say writers because that's a specific place I am in, but literally goes out to everyone else doing video, to podcast, to everything. You're limited to what your bosses think and your boss's politics, your boss's gender politics, for example, right? You write a story, you look at the editing of the story, look at some horrific additions which make it really sexist. Right? It happens many times if you ask people what their first draft looked like, and then what the editor made it look like, right? And your editor's job primarily is sales. Your editor's job is to create increased following, and they do it because they feel like if they make it more exciting in a certain way, you'll have more following. And so you have many cases of there's basic learning that needs to be done at the bottom, literally, but there are many cases where I realized where management won't let you shift. And so even when you want to have better stories addressing better things and with better frames, the end point becomes sales. And perhaps back to the discussion of how, a long time ago, there used to be this myth of a Chinese wall between editorial.
Editorial and the people actually.
But does it exist?
Yeah.
And it many of these things become money decisions. And the question is, how do you make these money decisions? How do you have a discussion with people whose thoughts are on money, and how do you push to them the fact that it would be more financially viable? There's someone who, Mwendengao, is working on a podcast around the media and gender, right? And one of the things she's talking about is the fact that and it's very true, right? Men shape media. And thus, when we talk about things like, for example, you say women don't like watching TV. She says if you just analyze what's on TV, you realize why.
Yeah.
Right? The media is not made for women. It's not made for women to consume. And so even many things like access to information, which pushes an extension like what gender equality would be, because many men have more access to information through TV, and that literally through media, that literally has economic impacts of it. But you have very few women at decision-making roles in media houses. That means all the content is tailored for men, the consumption becomes for men, and thus women are not only limited in just the role within media, women are impacted by all the economic impacts of what access to free media does. It's like a very
and information
system. Women literally have way more limited information because people don't understand it, right? People say, no, TV is available. TV is just there. If you want to watch it, you do. And so women choose not to watch it, right? That's. But if you analyze the why, you realize that news is just made around what men want to talk about and what men want to see, and thus it dissuades women from actually watching. Women will watch it, but for very certain shows. It doesn't mean women don't want to talk about politics. It just means that the way politics is framed is literally around the 5 men ruling this country.
That's very interesting, and like looking at how that then affects women's access to information, and then that has an effect on their economic capabilities. Like everything is very connected and interlinked. And maybe Sarah, I can bring you in here because I do know in terms of the space, we were just laughing earlier about you being in the organic chemistry space. And I was just like, I wish I knew you earlier when I was in school. But in terms of your own journey into a space that is seen as very male-dominated, do you think there needs to be more, even in terms of the media, more inclusion when it comes to certain stories around courses or subject areas that are seen as male-dominated, and really spotlighting that's an issue that's happening, and spotlighting that it's also a space for women? In your experience, do you think more needs to be done in terms of media spotlighting? Let's take, for example, the science space. What has been your experience?
Thank you, Adelle. When you talk about the media and what it exposes us to, the society, we usually have like some norms, some stereotypes, and some things that have been written down, whether verbal or non-verbal, that has been engraved into us, that makes us believe some things and make us act in such a way according to what we believe is right and what is wrong. And, this norms and these stereotypes actually sometimes come out from what we see, what we hear, and mostly from the media. So if we can have a society that we look at the media, and the media gives us another notion that which is like you have said, it is men dominated. The things they give us, there's no place for women. So most of the time we'll also try to change our minds, or it is engraved in our minds to start thinking the way we are seeing. If we see a lot of journalists who are just men, let's say the anchors are men, our minds will just be wired in a way that we are thinking all journalists must be men. If we see the political arena, you see the president, you see the big people in the government, and most of them are men, our thinking will also rotate in that area. So there's something that has been engraved into each and every one of us since we were born. And it is actually the stereotypes in the society. Sometimes we call them culture, but sometimes we call them different names. But all in all, it is what has been put into each and every one of us. So the issue now when it comes to actually the different subjects or the different careers, which are like, these are for ladies and these are for men, people actually tend to shift depending on what they have had, or around the community that they have lived in, their environment. What have you been taught? What have you been seeing? Have you been seeing this? This is what you're going to become. So if, like my experience, just like as a scientist, most of the time when you grow up, and this is just in African context, most of us, we usually believe these sciences are just, most of the time they're for men, because we associate the men with certain kinds of jobs. And because that is what our environment and the media has taught us. And we associate the ladies that we need to get into a softer career. I'm just saying soft in brackets, because it's not really soft. It's like we need to...
Exactly. No, I completely agree with you.
Yes, we need to get into a career where we can, we don't have to work a lot. We don't have to put all our efforts in. And my career, or why I actually chose to pursue science, let me say, because you'll see most of the ladies, we are actually populated in the humanities, in the social science, but in things like engineering, things like science, the ladies actually disappear from there. The percentage of ladies are actually very few. So what actually happens is we need, or I told myself I need to think like myself. I don't have to think like what people are telling me or how the society is looking at me. I need to really sit down and say, this is what I am good at. I remember when I was young, just a little bit of an experience. And, the society has taught us that these are what we should do as ladies, and this is what we should do as men. And I remember when I was young in our home, as ladies, we are 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So as the ladies, you're meant to do all the household chores. You're meant to cook, you're meant to wash dishes, you're meant to do almost everything. And the men in the house, or the brothers, I don't know whether it is the same case, because we're all brothers. But to us, we had both gender. So the men will just sit, they wait, they can loiter, they are free to do anything they want. That is our society, an African society. So they loiter around, then they come during lunchtime, and then they eat, then they disappear again. The next time you see them, But you as a lady, you are seated there, you're washing clothes, you're doing a lot of chores. And I remember when I was young, it never used to sit well with me, because I'll be in the kitchen and I'm holding my chemistry book. You're trying to read, and you have a lot of chores. So I used to ask my mom, why can't we help each other out so that we can finish this thing fast? But my mom could not. She was like, you need to learn how to be a woman. Such scenario, it is not because of our problem. It is what we have been taught, what we have been seeing, and what has been engraved in us. So I actually sat down and I told myself, even if I am placed in the same platform with men, yes, they have a lot of free time. They can do a lot of things. And I'm over here doing a lot of trying to be a woman, at the same time trying to be a educationist, a scientist. Yeah. So I told myself, I need to actually work more than what I am. I need to actually put a step ahead compared to my brothers. At that time, at a young age, you are competing with your brothers. Who is better, who has performed well. And each and every time I wanted to perform better than my brothers, simply because I was like, there's something wrong somewhere. There's something wrong in the society. We are not placed in the same platform, and yet we are expected to perform in the same way. So for me, I decided, let me do this, because I wanted to show that in every challenge, in the things that they think that the men are better, I wanted to prove that we can also be able to do it. And that was like a driving force towards science. So I really entered everything into science just to prove that we are also capable. Although we have a lot of challenges, but we can still do something.
Yeah. That is so interesting to learn that, you're trying to balance of this gender rules at such a young age, while still also trying to pursue something that you're genuinely interested in, which is science, right? And how then are you expected to be able to not even compete, but just deliver? Anything you want to prosper needs time. So if you don't have the time to actually put into that, how are you going to advance it? And I love that you've brought up culture, because that's the next stop that I want us to make. And maybe, Naomi, you can bring in your experience here. First, before even we get to our personal experiences culture-wise and how that has probably affected the journey towards gender equality, which is a very long journey, but we're in it nonetheless. At Flown and the women who go through the different programs that you have and then get put into the transport industry, what is the societal reactions to them? Because sometimes you'll catch on media a story about a female conductor. And there's some that I watch and I'm like, okay, this is good, this is inspiring, it shows you there's something about visualizing and seeing that, okay, this is a space for women because you've seen other women in it. But there's some where you feel like they're almost running a mockery around how that story is told. And it always makes me wonder, okay, so society, how are we reacting to women being placed in industries that were male dominated, women just trying to earn a living? What have you noticed about how society reacts to those women?
Oh, my good Lord, I could talk for days. So I think it's a mix of, she's so brave, versus why is she there? And how did she get there? I think in almost every career you can think of where it's very male dominated, people have questions about how a woman got in there and whether there were any sexual favors involved in getting there. Right. And it's not about how hardworking the woman is or whether she's passionate about, for example, getting into the matatu industry. So, for example, even it's a struggle that for most people, they're like, so you're passionate about the matatu industry? And I'm like, yes, it's very fascinating. Right. And like what people think that it's chaotic, there's nothing really chaotic about the industry once you get into it. Everything is right where it should be. And so on that, I would say that society is kind of, not sure what to think of the women. We try to work with the media to get women who are working in this industry highlighted in more positive light, right? So, for example, one of our women, Elizabeth, owns a matatu and she runs it with her husband. So her husband is the driver and she's the conductor. And there was a feature done, I think, on either one TV station and a newspaper article. And there's a lady who called Elizabeth and she said, my husband is a matatu owner and a driver. And now you've inspired me to get into the industry because she'd been looking for a job, but she never thought of her husband's business. Right? So I would say that was a success story. In terms of, the panelists have talked very interesting about socialization and how has been the media's influence on socialization of our children, right? So for example, when I was growing up, my dad was very intentional about what I watched. I had to come up with a calendar and also justify what I want to watch. And my dad used TV as a way to talk about life issues. For example, I was not allowed to watch Tom and Jerry. I think by now you can tell how old I am. Because
We're there with you in the same age, don't worry.
he used it as a way to talk about non-violent way of resolving conflict, because Tom and Jerry did not do that. They were very violent towards each other when they could have, used other non-violent strategies to resolve their conflict. And I think that speaks to the power of media, and I think I don't think we fully understand, especially in this day and age of TikTok and Twitter and, access to, 42 stations and radio, and how it influences our children and what they think is the right behaviors. Right. So, for example, another thing my dad did is that we would watch soap operas together. Right now, I honestly can't watch soap operas because he spoiled it for me.
Yeah.
So he would have various themes. He would say, okay, this is how romantic love works. This is wrong. This is right. This is drama. This is, And so whenever I look at TV, I just see themes.
But what I'm also seeing is like it's guided,
Yes, it's also,
which is important because sometimes if you watch it, especially at a young age, and there's no guidance into what you're consuming. So I commend him for that, actually.
Yeah, and kids and even kids, teenagers are, psychologists call it tabula rasa, where they're like a blank slate, right? And they absorb a lot of things. And as a parent, you should be there to guide them through that. So, for example, one of the things I see in most homesteads is that when the kissing action starts, they'll be like, oh, change the station.
Yeah.
No, my dad will be like, so this is what happens, and this is how it should happen, right? And if it's a soap opera you've been watching, you'll be like, no, this is somebody's wife, and this is somebody's husband, this is wrong, this is what this is called, right? And this is, and you talk about manipulation and deceit, and that's not what should be happening in relationships. So we can use TV as a way to instill the values we want. And even when TV, for example, has lessons that are not good, that's an opportunity to talk to your kids about this is not right. Even with Tom and Jerry, I was allowed to watch it, but there was a lot of lessons in it.
Wow, that is so commendable. Something
So
like
surprised.
Tom and Jerry. Now that you mentioned it, I'm like, actually, yes, they were not being very efficient in resolving the conflict, right? That's something that will stay with me for a while, and I hope those who are watching are actually like stopping to think, which is really the reason we're having these conversations, is to spark you having that introspection and thinking, okay, what's my role and how do I influence those around me? Naomi's dad clearly has influenced us without even being in the room.
Yes.
And so let's expound on this culture, right? I like to call it a cultural audit because I think first and foremost, it's very wide to say the Kenyan culture, because I think it's made up of smaller
Cultures.
ways of doing things.
Subcultures.
You know what I mean? And you almost have to meet each where they're at. So it's also hard to say the African culture because now it's even a
What
bigger
is African
play.
culture?
You know, and it's made up by things that are similar but also very, very different. So perhaps you could think about this from your own experience and your own cultural journey, and do a bit of an audit and think about, okay, are there any changes we need to make in order for us to kind of advance the actualization of gender equality? And are there things that are working actually, and you're like, if we scale, let's tell people about this one that's working, and if we scale, it can work. I don't know. What do you think, Marika?
Learning and unlearning.
Yeah,
So-
the hardest thing.
It is. So one of the funniest things, I listened to your story about your dad, and like I'm in awe, to be honest. And made me realize, like, when we thought about some stories we listened to as kids, and then like we analyzed them, they're not really as exciting as we thought about it. Basic example is like a story about Sleeping Beauty and like consent. I'm like, yo, my guy.
Yeah.
That's really, yeah.
That was not really the romantic story you think it was.
When you unpack it.
When you unpack it, so many of these really innocent things that we talked about,
Yeah.
but really, really, really problematic, right?
Yeah.
And it literally goes from undoing that, right? One of the biggest things I feel, I don't know, that needs to be done and undone is school and the way teaching is done. That's people don't connect the personal and political. And so like when people talk about, for example, how teachers act and how teachers discipline you and how we turned out okay, but I'm like, no. There are so many things that we should have not been taught. Gender roles, in fact, were enforced so strongly in school. We're more in school than we're at home for majority of the time, right? But in terms of, I realize a lot of the ways in which we tackle gender equality don't tackle teachers. We tackle girls and tell them to be stronger. We tell them to be stronger. This is how to protect yourself, right? There are little to no programs around boys, and at best, you're going to have a program when you're around 13 or 14 about how to be a man, right? But there's very few programs targeting teachers and gender equality. That's a very big problem because that's primarily where you learned your gender norms.
And that's
right?
your first point of influence, really. If you think about your experience with your teacher, it's so profound what you've said. Because when you're younger, your teacher is even above your parents, you know?
Because in nursery school, right, it's gendered. So most nursery schools are taught by women, like the exceptions. But my whole nursery life had no man. And I went back to my nursery school about a couple of years back and there was one. Could have a span of 30 plus years and there's only one man teaching. But again, even at a basic level of what that is that what does that teach children about caregiving at an early age and who is responsible for it? We didn't see men taking care of us until we're what? Because the best at which primary school teachers come when you're what, 7 or 8. You've had your formative years of your caregiving solely being lineated to women. Your diapers were changed by women, your discipline was done by women. So men come later on in your life. Then these men again when you have men who are still primarily teaching, so there's still a very heavy patriarchal system, but no accountability for it. And so you have a lot of problematic things when you think through, because I went to a Christian school, right? And when you look at just many ways, the role of like religion and gender inequality is massive because a lot of this was just encultured in that.
Yeah.
And so you had a mixture of very heavy religion and lack of awareness about gender equality and a lot of patriarchy, and mix that together and you have a lifetime of people who go through that, because I went through a religious high school too, and the same problematic teachings and moral and ways of working were pushed through that, right? But we never have discussions around teachers, and I feel like that's a very big thing.
I've never stopped to think about it until you've mentioned it. I think I didn't have any male teachers until campus. So there's the verbal things you're learning, but also you're shaping truths in your head based on what is around you. That's something I actually had to go and think about, introspect. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I feel like when it talks about like your working programs on transport, I feel like on programs on education, so many of them are, and it's so sad we're at a basic level of many programs around education at a basic level of just getting girls in. Like that's the level at which we're just convincing parents to please let your child come to school. You don't have to pay school fees, and that is still
it's still
fight,
yeah.
But we need to move beyond that, and I feel like we need to reteach teaching. It's complex because reteaching teaching means changing. Literally, all of it is political because it goes back to changing the whole education system. Because these teachers come from this system where they didn't experience male teachers or any actual guidance about masculinity in terms of positively until the university, and then you want them to change suddenly when they become lecturers or teachers in university. So a lot of that needs to change at that level. Right? You talk about like how many teachers do you have, for example, lecturers teaching education. That's good. How many women are there? Okay, next, apart from the women that are good, they're men, right? Are these feminist women and feminist men? Because again, getting you in is the first step, but sometimes in many cases you go ahead and you uphold the patriarchy that is oppressing you, right?
It's not enough.
Even for men, basic level for men is, I think I try, and I realize it's very hard to see and it took me a while to see, is that men are the primary beneficiaries of patriarchy, but men also suffer very heavily under it. Yet unless you are heterosexual, white, and very wealthy, you fall somewhere at the bottom rungs of all of this. And even men who suffer very heavily under patriarchy is still protected.
Yeah, and that's the conversation also that's kind of hard when you're talking about the system that upholds where we are today and trying to figure out, okay, how do we get to a state of gender equality? It means you have to dismantle that system. And for me, I constantly have to tell men, this also benefits you. The same way you've talked about even like the program you had during COVID, and you send this money to one woman that benefits a household that for sure there are men and young boys who are benefiting from this situation. You know what I mean? Yeah. But it's never unpacked that way.
But you'd have to... one of the hardest parts is for men to give up power, because a basic example is men complaining about being the maid breadwinners in houses, right? But the same men don't want women to have equal job opportunities. So they complain about their wives not working and earning a similar income, but don't want to actually let them work and earn the similar income, but still come back and feel the same burden of it. It's burdening you. Yeah. The catch is they want to hold on to that, because many times when you hold on to that, you hold on to the power, because money is power in many situations. It's not just money, it's resources, it's access to education, it's access to opportunities. So in many ways, they complain about it, but the reason they hold on to it is because their ability to be the sole provider comes with the power involved. So many in many situations, if you're being honest, want like the pros and not the cons. So they want like the woman to come in and bring the money, but the money to be theirs and the decision-making power to be theirs. So there's one of the hardest things to do is to give up one for the other, because what you're doing many times is giving up power, which becomes the hardest situation.
And it speaks to the cost that you spoke about. And of course, we are here. If you're just joining us, you're probably wondering, okay, so this is on the French Embassy page, and we're at Radio France, and we're talking about what we want to do for Africa, and just trying to figure out, okay, where's the connection, which of course is in October. It's the Africa-France Summit that we're gearing up towards, and we're having these conversations to kind of rethink, what does that relationship look like? We've also seen a lot of feminine diplomacy when it comes to France. And I think it's the same thing as we see here, where I spoke about the commitments that we see being done at the top. But do they actually trickle down to our everyday lives? And I just wonder, is there an opportunity for not only cross-continental collaboration, and what... I've been seeing a lot of that conversation online. What does that mean, knowing that our relationship comes from past hurts and wrongs that have not really been talked about, right? Is there an opportunity for other continents to learn from us, or us to learn from them? I don't know. What do you think? Anybody can jump in.
Yes, I think there's a lot. You look at how, for example, the American culture has managed to transfer its values through movies and films, and even through donor giving.
Yeah.
Right. So that has been very intentional, where, we've gotten to a point, for example, right now, people would say, when you look at the way America is reflected in movies versus the way news reflect, it's like two different things, right? But that was a very conscious decision to take their values and what they wanted the world to see them as into our, again, media, into our TV stations, into our laptops, into songs, like almost everything we watch, right? And so when you do maybe from a psychological point of view an audit of cultures, you see, for example, the African culture, and just allow me to use that word. We have a lot more collectivism, what is called, unlike the Western culture where there's a lot of individualism, right? So, for example, in my home, we grew up where my grandmother was in the middle of the homestead, and all of us were around her, right? And so I was brought up by, about 5 dads.
Yeah. Even our language, Baba Mdogo, Baba,
Baba Mkubwa. And then you look at other cultures, for example, the UK, where one of their biggest issues is loneliness. And I remember reading this and I was like, wait, what? Of all the issues, loneliness?
What is that?
Right? And that's been brought about by their collective, culture, as I would call it. And then I was like, that was never my issue at home. It was more like there's no privacy because there's always a relative around. There's always somebody as a kid looking at you. And that person has the ability to discipline you, right? And then they'll tell on your parents who will now again discipline you. Right. And so I feel that there are values like that we could transfer to, for example, cultures like the UK, right, who already have declared loneliness as, a key issue, right, in their country. And there's even like a minister of loneliness. That's not the only thing the minister does, but that's one of their
dockets.
Yes, right. And so imagine if we were able to do an audit of what works in terms of collectiveness and being like, this is how you can, engage with your community.
True.
This is how you can bring about the community to support you.
That's quite interesting. That's actually that sense of community. And I've been doing a lot of reading up into even just who had different rules in my Luo culture, my grandmother's rule and things like that. And going back to that and thinking, actually, if we stayed with that or adopted something close to it, even in terms of education around gender issues, there would be a very... it would be an efficient way to break down these key issues to young Africans so that by the time now we're 30, whatever, we kind of are coming to the conversation really informed, So it's very interesting that you bring this up. Sarah, what do you think when you look at culturally, are there things that other continents could actually learn from us?
According to me, there's obviously things that on other continents, just like Naomi has said, they're going to learn with what we are doing. But if we are to talk about gender equality, and you have said we cannot generalize and say African culture because every culture is different. Even there's a culture for the urban people and there's a culture for the rural people. It's different. But generally, when you look at it, there's something that is wanting in our African culture when it comes to gender equality, because most of our cultures, they're geared towards the patriarchal system. And that is how we grew up. And it's like we are really adamant on coming out from there. It's like our minds have really been deep-rooted in this kind of system. So there's a lot of, when you talk about gender equality in our cultures, there's a lot of things that we should actually start learning from the West. Just like an example, let me just bring one culture in a rural society. Just an example, one day when I was a little bit young and I was in the rural part and there was a dispute between neighbors. So in the rural society, in the urban, you'll go to court. But in the rural society, you'll go to what is called the chiefs. Now, the chiefs are going to tell you now, go and meet the village elders. So I remember this day, and the village elders came to our compound. They were doing it outside. And because I wasn't really part of it, I was just in the house peeping through the window. And the village elders came. They were elders. Actually, they were men. There was no elder, which is a woman, and that is our culture. And these elders comprise of even drunkards. But so long as they were old, they were capable to sit in that authority. So they formed like a circle, and they were sitting somewhere in front, the elders, then the rest of the people that were concerned, and my mom was part of the people that are concerned. But one thing that never sat well with me is every time a lady will stand to give a testimony, they'll go in front and kneel down. And it is outside in the compound. So they'll kneel down and give their views or their experience,
Their
what
case,
they witnessed. And if it was a man, they'll just go and stand and give their witness. And, I stood at the window for long just observing that, and to me, it wasn't sitting well. So afterwards, I came and asked my mom, why were you kneeling down? You are kneeling down in front of drunkards. You are a respected man in the society. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
And my mom was like, no, it is the culture, it is respect. And I was telling her, this is not respect. There's something that you are not getting. So there's something in our cultures that we have just accepted it, but we have never questioned whether it is the right way or the wrong way. We are just accepting all of it. And we have never brought women to come and air their views, what they think of our cultures. Are we okay when we are just doing given all the roles in the family? There was a time I lived in the northern parts of Kenya in the Turkana County, and in that place I realized that women are actually doing everything from the house chores, everything from the kettle, from the animals. They have a lot of goats, so it is the women that are taking care of it. And the role of the men, because I asked them, what is the role of the men, seriously, if you are even doing the fencing yourself? And they told me the men, their work was to guard, to protect the society. But the times have changed. We don't have wars anymore. So the men will take their small stools and then go to the village market. They either sit down and gossip, they either sleep, and they're waiting for wars, which are not there. But the women are doing a lot of stuff. Almost everything. They're taking care of their kids in their home. And no one has even given them a platform that they can air their views. Is it okay? So in terms of cultural, our culture, our Kenyan culture, let me talk about the Kenyan culture. It's really wanting. We really need to learn a lot from the intercontinental, from the Europeans, from the other continents that do not have the same setting with us.
I like what you said, and one more thing is, like, even the system, is it efficient? Like, if we even break it down to, is this moving this community efficiently? No, it is not. Okay, so what do we need to change? You wanted to add?
I was just tickled by that story. Because it is true. There are many things which make no sense at all. Preparing for wars, like you're saying, wars don't exist. You have warriors who are not fighting anybody else. Right? It's not my great grandfather's time when they used to go steal cattle.
Yeah.
Right? They still exist somewhere, but most times it doesn't. I was thinking through your question, right? It's thinking through the complexity of it, because as you've said, the Africa-Europe relation started off from a point where you call hurt, the actual word is colonization. That's what we're trying to address, right? Now, fun fact, right? The first country to have gender reassignment surgery for free and state-sponsored was Egypt in the world. Except when we think about, like, gender equality, gender rights, and expression, we look at, like, Arab countries as repressive.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of things that have been lost around.
And
history.
maybe it goes back to the media conversation we had,
Fun fact about Egypt. For the longest time, when I was a child, I didn't know that there were black people in Egypt. Until my dad worked in Egypt. And I went there and like, wait, what? Half the country? How?
Yeah.
But there's absolutely, as a child, there's no representation of black people in Egypt at all. When you learned the pharaohs were literally black and extremely dark, and that's a point at which literally they literally cut their noses off so no one could tell that they were black people. That's a massive part of history, right? But also, if you go back to when you talk about gender and gender equality, is if you look back at traditional society, the roles of gender were not particularly as they are now. A lot of things changed between post-colonization, mixture of religion, all those things are now. There are many societies, for example, which like go back to the Kikuyu tradition, Kamba tradition, around like expressions around sexuality and gender were very varied, and they changed. And power wasn't necessarily outrightly bestowed on those things put together. There's way more acceptability, and everyone had their roles, right? And when you start looking at it back now, you're like, yo, there are very many. When you tell people, for example, there are very many queer people in African society, guys like, no.
Yeah.
Except when you have to, and when we talk about like how people should learn is that I do feel there's a lot of learning from Europe about how traditional African societies actually run. One of the more complex things usually in my head which I haven't resolved is when you have conversations about matriarchal societies. It's always very interesting because
those existed for us, yeah.
They did, but it's very hard to imagine them at this
Where
current-
we are, yeah.
It's very hard to imagine about this current point in time as to how they actually existed, right? Because my own community, right? If you go back to Kikuyu land in many senses, women, when you talk about like what women do, a lot of central part of Kenya, women run households, right? So women run the households, educate the children. Men many times get away with way less. However, the power still rests with the men. So women till the land, but only less than 10% of women have actual title deeds and access to land rights. So it becomes this complex. I feel like there's a lot of heavy learning around traditional African society and how it ran around gender.
Pre-colonization.
Around gender and power. So a caveat is that this what many times we look back and we like to romanticize what like African culture looked like. I wouldn't want to go back. You know, the people say, back in my day. No. I hope it's back in your day, right?
Yeah.
We have like medicine and like nutrition.
Yeah.
Many things going on right now, right? We have Wi-Fi. I don't want to go back. So yeah, we need to look back at it and learn from it without romanticizing it and take the best parts of it out of that. Yeah.
And so we're kind of running out of time, which is so crazy how time flies when you're really enjoying the conversation and learning so much. And I just want to take it back to where we began. Obviously, we have the New African France Summit coming up in October. We also have the Gender Equality Forum coming up. That is, a collaboration between France, Mexico, and the UN Women. And they're going to be all of these heads of states or policymakers who are going to be coming together to address this issue that affects us on a day-to-day, right? Wherever we are now, we can say the broad term of African culture, because wherever you are, it affects you on a day-to-day. Maybe it just looks different on ground. And so I would like to, in closing, just invite you to speak to those global leaders, speak to the policymakers, some of who are going to come from our own country. What are at least one pressing issue that you want them to address when this forum comes together?
Mine would be accountability, right? We've had way too many conferences and way too many promises. We need to have tangible impact, and that's the truth. Everyone makes promises, right? There's literal one of ours giving support to the European Union last year, early on this year. And, part of my work is involved research around like gender and a lot of the, we signed treaties from like way back to every single declaration to the formation of UN Women to like all these things, right? All these are very good and important things, right? So people usually go and sign treaties and then go back and maintain status quo and then come back the next year and make some more promises.
Yeah.
I need people to hold each other accountable. I need us to hold our own leaders accountable. When you come to this conference, the first thing I want people to ask each other is, what progress have you made since the last one? Are you just coming here are you coming here for conferences? Conferences are nice, but what actual tangible change are you having? What movement have you changed? And in what tangible ways do you expect to change by the next one? And for you to accept to be held responsible, you don't even have to accept it. We will hold you responsible for all the promises that you make.
That's very true. I think at a national level and global level, it's like enough promises, they sound good. What are the action points and the progress? Sarah, what would you want them to focus on for you?
Maybe to add on what he has said on if these guys, if it is like a support system, most of the time people come, they give promises like he has said, and we expect things to be done. And if it is in gender equality, most of the things that we really need to change is our culture, the way we are thinking. So we cannot change just from our policymakers, let's say in Kenya, because they'll tell us, do this, do that, but it has to come from within. It has to come from us, the normal each and every Kenyan. So there has to be some agents in the society who are not the policy makers, so that they can be able to convince themselves or ourselves that we need to change. So without them, that is the reason sometimes when money can be given and nothing works. It's like we have done a lot of things. We have done a lot of sensitization, a lot of dissemination, but there's no output. It's because we are lacking the fact that we need to make people accept it or accept the change from within. So I'll expect our partners or the collaborators to actually not only act like the donors, but to become like a link between the policymakers and the agents in the society, so that they can pull these two together and make the bond between the policymakers and the agents of the society, so that we can accept what the policies, if they are good, they're going to bring about gender equality. So we really need a link, and this is what is actually missing, which we are actually needed.
I totally hear what you're saying. That's a very interesting take. What about you, Naomi?
I would say walk a mile in the shoes of your community. So for example, with transport, right? So most of the policies that are being implemented are being drafted and adopted by people who are in their personal cars, air-conditioned cars. I'm not sure when was the last time they got on a boda, right? I'm not sure when was the last time they used matatu. But for example, if we are to get policymakers to use public transport, I can assure you there will be changes. If we can get, the government, for example, the president, to be stuck in traffic like most of us are, then that would change, for example, right? If they are to sit in the commuter train, which, by the way, there was a time I took it and I wish I would have walked. It is so slow, right? And then you're just like, doom, doom, doom. And if we could get policymakers to actually use the systems and the services that they are endorsing, for example, even go to a public hospital, that public hospital would change, right? And so I think they have good intentions, right? But they are working from a point of privilege, a lot of privilege, right? And there's a discrepancy between what is happening to, for example, let's say, normal Kenyans or normal Africans versus what their lived experiences is, right? And so I would say, okay, drop the personal cars, drop the life in, I don't know, a suburb, right? Even if it's a week, just a week, take a matatu. I was in a place where I worked where you were encouraged, for example, even if you had a personal car, you would have to take a matatu at least once or twice a day.
To understand what it is, the problems you're trying to solve.
Because you can't keep designing systems that you're not using, right? And then another thing is that we have very good policies, and we've ratified so many documents, but the enforcement is not there, right? And so please don't develop another policy again. Just enforce what you have, and then from then on we can have a conversation that, okay, we have a national transport policy, right? We have the Maputo protocol. What happened when we implemented it? This is what happened. So based on what happened, then we are making this and these changes, and then we'll keep looking at it, right? But what we've done is that we have very good policies that are just in a bookshop somewhere, at a reception somewhere, right? Yeah, when they should be implemented.
Yeah, I had that. I read a quote the other day. Somebody said that on paper we are very, very advanced, but then because there's no implementation, it's almost like two different countries. I think for me, in closing, it would be, especially because at these forums, there's no evading conversations around economic recovery. Post-pandemic, right, for each and every country. And for me, it's not only to the global leaders and policymakers, but even to you who's watching this, is what does gender equality mean to you? You really need to start introspecting and unpacking that. And then what does centering women in economic recovery mean to you? What does it look like on a day-to-day basis? And I had to do that work, and defining that and writing that out almost will cause you to have to change your behaviors, to have to change the questions you ask in the rooms that you are privileged enough to enter. And I think that would be a great closing point for me. So I'm so thankful that you agreed to be here with us today. You offered your knowledge and your personal life stories as well that we've learned from. Came as far as Eldoret. So Naomi, Mariga, Sarah, thank you so much for having this very necessary conversation with us. And thank you to everybody who is watching this live, who will catch this later on. I hope it inspires you to have more conversations going forward as we lead up to the Generation Equality Forum that's coming up, and obviously the Africa in France Summit that's coming up in October. Thank you for watching. My name is Adelle Onyango, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.